Hello! In today's episode, we're delighted to introduce Kris De Meyer, a research fellow in neuroscience at the Department of Neuroimaging at King's, and also part of the Climate Action Unit at UCL. Kris works with environmental scientists, policymakers, and conservation NGOs to support them in communicating more constructively about controversial environmental topics such as climate change. He regularly speaks on the BBC and TV about polarization in society and why fake news can be so believable. Hello and welcome to the session today. I guess our first question is really to get to know you in your career journey. So how did you begin working at the intersection of climate change and mental health? And what were kind of some of the key skills that got you where you were, or some of the barriers you faced?
So I was a neuroscientist looking at how the brain makes sense of what we're perceiving. And I was basically building models of brain operation. And somewhere in late 2009, 2010, started to realize that actually that was only having a limited impact on society. And specifically because as sort of like a citizen, I was interested in seeing more and more societal debates become very polarized and with groups of people that were fighting with one another over the right interpretation of things or what the right solution was to a problem. And so I had started to look at these social debates through the lenses of what I knew about how brains work. And then climate change, come sort of 2007, 2008, started to become one of those controversial topics. It wasn't before. In the early 2000s, pretty much the whole of the UK was sort of on board with generic messages about like climate change is going to be a problem and we need to do something about this. But something changed towards the end of the 2000s. And so I started to become interested in that polarizing nature of climate change and started to work more and more on how people are making sense of climate change, whether it's happening, whether it's not happening, how dangerous it's going to get, or how innocuous it will be in the future. And then more specifically, what we're going to do about it, how we are taking action on it. And that's then where, from 2010 onwards, I really started to think about like, how do you push knowledge from neuroscience and psychology about how controversy in society arises, how you circumvent it, how you navigate it, into the way that we communicate about climate change. So I started to work with climate scientists from about 2012 onwards to help them to understand what neuroscientists and psychologists know about brains that can help them become more effective communicators.
I think that those are some very interesting points about how it's developed over time. And in light of that, can I ask, what does mental health in the area of climate change mean to you? And how does that perhaps differ from other disciplines?
So the mental health issue around climate change has only become part of that conversation over the last few years. Before that, there were like small groups of people who were really getting anxious and depressed about the state of the climate, but it was quite a niche thing. And somewhere around 2017, 2018, you started that emergence of the term eco-anxiety. And it's a sort of a natural response for people, especially young people's brains who are going through some kind of critical development stages in their lives and constantly bombarded with negative messages about climate and the environment, for them to start seeing the problem in a very specific, bleak and black way. And that then leads to the feelings of anxiety that people may have. Now, that's a different thing from the kind of stuff they study here at the IOPPN, where they look at like how people are suffering severe depression, severe anxiety disorders, personality disorders, psychosis, all of those things. Those are sort of the outliers of the bad things that can happen to people's brains and mental health. And the eco-anxiety, to some degree, is a much more normal response to being bombarded with negative messages. So, of course, for some people, it can move from this constant worry and concern about climate change to a space where they can't come out of bed in the morning anymore, or they think that everything is hopeless and there is no solution anymore to the problems of climate change. But by and large, for most of us who are concerned and worried about climate change, even to the point that we're anxious, it is a recognizable response, a normal response, and it's not necessarily a mental illness response, but it is a mental health response, or it is a topic of mental health, because if we're thinking about ourselves as wanting to be healthy people that have a sort of a positive outlook on life, then that's getting in the way. So the people's perceptions of climate change is getting in the way of that. The really interesting thing is that we're not here. This isn't the first time. This isn't the first time that we're in this situation. So whenever I started to talk with people about climate change and the anxiety that comes from it, people who are 5 to 10 years older than me, they will say, oh, I remember when I was a teenager waking up in the middle of the night from a nightmare in cold sweats about the threat of nuclear holocaust, nuclear war. And so in the 1970s and 80s, there were entire generations of young people who thought about their future in exactly the way as some young people think now about their future, or the lack of their future perhaps, because that threat was also happening at that time to those young people. And if you look at social scientists and psychologists who were researching that back in the day, you find papers from, let's say, the 1980s, where you can take out the word nuclear war and plug in the word climate change, and everything else in the sentence still works. Everything else in the sentence still talks about young people's sense of like having no future, not wanting any children because of the state of the climate and everything. And so that kind of is like, and so the next thing then that I realized when people started to say that is like, oh, it's people of a certain generation. It's people that are 5 years older than me. I didn't have that. When those stories of the possibility of nuclear war came out in the 1980s, which is the last time that it really became very public, I was too young. My brain didn't absorb it. But then for those a little bit older, it really became an issue. And so we're now seeing things with young people who have been constantly exposed to the negative messaging around climate change, who then come to signify those problems of mental health, basically.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's true that there's a lot of negative discourse around climate change, and that I feel that has an effect on how I perceive things. I guess my next question is really, how has your kind of work around climate change communication influenced how you've thought about these issues of eco-anxiety, and how can our communication strategies as a society really help us with this problem?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think from my perspective, there are two approaches that you can take to dealing with the eco-anxiety that is building up in people. The first one is that you take some kind of therapeutic approach where you're trying to help people work through those emotions and so on and so forth. And there will certainly be places where that is needed and that is possible. But at a societal level, there isn't enough therapy in the world that can help us to cope with the havoc that is coming our way. So we really have to find as a society another way to deal with this threat to our mental health than thinking about it through the lens of like, there is a problem, we need to solve it with therapy. Some people might want to solve it with medicine or with medication. There would be certainly lots of fights between the different groups of people that want therapy versus medication. I would say there's a third way. And the third way is to create a groundswell movement of action on climate change that takes away this feeling of powerlessness and this constant barrage of the negative stories. So one of the things that we're advocating in the work that we do is that communicators should tell stories of action, not stories of concern, not stories about climate change is a big issue that is threatening our future, but stories of like, this is what we are doing to deal with that problem. And that's not like individual action in terms of like, I'm flying less or I'm eating less meat. That's important that those stories exist. But it's all the things that you can be doing as a society to tackle climate change. And if you fast forward to 2030 or 2040, and you think of what the society would look like if we were really seriously cracking climate change, almost everything would be different. And everything that you can imagine would be different in that period in the future. That's a potential place where we need to act, where we need to develop knowing how to act in that space, and then also where we need to tell stories of the things that we are doing in that space. So stories of action as the antidote for stories of concern and looking at climate change as a threatening issue, and then opportunities for action and working out how to do the certain things as the putting into practice then the things that will then eventually allow us to get to a safer place.
I believe that distinction between taking action and thinking about climate hope versus climate hopelessness is something very important to turn things into action. And in light of that, your research, which focuses on psychology and neuroscience and trying to translate that into actionable plans, from your perspective, what do you think the best way is to turn people's eco and climate anxiety into actionable behavior?
So it really is by giving people the recipes for knowing how to act. So if climate change were food, our sophistication to talk about climate change would be, if you don't eat, you're going to die. That's the stage where we are at the moment. And constantly we're putting that message out. If we don't take urgent action, we're going to be in big trouble. So the thing is, we don't communicate about eating in that way. We have cooking shows. We have cooking celebrities. We give people cookbooks as a Christmas present. We have a whole culture around the doing of cooking and the teaching, the helping people to understand how they can eat healthy and good food. In that's what the whole sort of narrative of Bake Off and all of these other cooking shows is based on. And yet on climate, we don't have that. And it's maybe even more important or as important as eating healthily. So we need to really shift to that place where we help people to understand how they can make change in their lives, not just tell them you have to change. And that is not only citizens, that is also politicians, business people, finance people. All the work that we do with them constantly brings home to us how they don't know how to act. It's even the ones who are concerned about climate change and the ones who know they need to do something, they go like, yeah, but what more can I do than I'm currently already doing? My job description doesn't allow me to do X. My role as a politician, I need to listen to all of the concerns of my constituents. And if not enough of my constituents are coming with climate change as a problem, then I need to balance it with all of the other things that they're asking. So helping people to understand how to take action, that's the thing that needs to happen.
What kind of advice would you give students, for example, somewhere like London that's already quite an overwhelming city and there's, kind of a lot of obstacles to deal with in daily life? What is something that you can what could you do to kind of tackle this problem generally of negative communication around climate change and eco-anxiety that kind of results from that?
So the first one is to think about the influence that you can have, maybe not immediately right now, but in the future beyond your own carbon footprint. So a lot of the pressure that gets put on people at the moment is about reducing their own carbon footprint by eating less meat, flying less, taking public transport, those kind of things. And they're important, but they're not the only places where people can act. So it's about thinking like, if I'm studying this particular thing right now, how is that going to help me to be in a good position in 5 or 10 years' time to become a leader in a piece of climate action that needs to happen in my sector? That could be law, economy, English literature, arts, science, any of those fields have the ability for people to start thinking about and start imagining about what can we do differently such that this part of society helps with the big transition, the big transformation that all of us need to do. And so that's the first thing, is like broaden your imagination about where you can have impact in the long term. Don't put too much pressure on yourself right now. You are a student, you are getting yourself ready for being influential in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. And then secondly, find like-minded people who want to do the same thing as you want to do. So if you're studying law and you want to think about like, how can we use law better, or how can we use one aspect of the law better to drive the transition towards a sustainable society, then find other people and do that in community. Don't try to do it all by yourself. And the more you do this, the more you find your niche where you can be active, the more you find like-minded people who help you to develop that collectively. And the more you understand that there will be other people who will take care of other parts of the system, the more that pressure will be lifted from yourself.
It's a really amazing point you make on the impact of collective action and finding those mutual understandings amongst people to drive positive change. So thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, and I definitely think that when you kind of are in these like-minded community spaces is when you start to feel that empowerment. And I've felt that even on protests in London, where you're walking around with hundreds of people thinking, yes, you know, like we're all in this together and we can kind of come out of this situation. In your work generally, and for example, working in this climate action unit at UCL, have you found that working in these groups of like-minded people, as you were saying, has helped you kind of maybe feel more empowered and taking more of a stand on these issues in the workplace, for example? Because sometimes it can be hard to kind of see where sustainability fits in to any sort of career, especially in science. It's not always easy to maybe make changes, like we have sustainable labs at King's and getting rid of, for example, biological waste and things that are contaminated. It's actually much more complicated than it seems. And I think that also stops people acting because, as you said, it's not kind of an easy path. But yeah, have you felt that kind of empowerment, I guess, from your work and in doing that research?
Yeah, so absolutely. I have to say I don't really feel anxiety about climate change, and it would be possible for me to feel the anxiety. I know for sure that if I were to expose myself to a certain type of headlines in The Guardian, or would read the articles all the time and not do anything else, then I would feel really, really bad about the things that are going to happen in the future. But the way that I deal with it is to tell myself, like, there are things that I can change, and I will try as best as possible to change those things. And I will then meet lots of people who are trying to change other things in the system. And that makes me understand that it's not all my responsibility. The weight isn't on my shoulders alone. It's shared across the whole of humanity. But within the expertise that I have, I try to effect as much change as possible. And that then makes me not feel powerless, because I constantly see the impacts of what we are doing with the Climate Action Unit. So we work with scientists, with policymakers, with people in financial organizations, with local authorities, local communities. And in each of those places, we're affecting a bit of change. And we know then that change is part of the bigger change that needs to happen across society. And so it means that I don't feel the anxiety, because I have the sense of agency, a sense of knowing what to do with that situation. That alleviates that sense of anxiety for myself. As I said, I could well feel it if I were to expose myself only to one type of messages and not have the action part to it. But that then goes to show like how we need to manage our own mental health. We need to make sure that we don't get dragged down the stream of negative thinking and negative messages around this, but really try to find like how can we get to a place where we know what it is that we can contribute uniquely. And so the question that everyone should be asking is, what can I uniquely do to contribute this? And this is like, if you're working, so this may be easier for some academic disciplines than for others, but if you are working in an academic discipline that makes that you're going to take a key position in society, either as an economist, as a lawyer, as a social scientist, as someone who wants to go into politics and all of those things, you're going to have a position of influence. So think about the way that you can impact sustainability in that indirect way, not just about like what waste you are producing or what emissions you are producing. That's part of the thing that needs to change for all of us. But for many students, there is that opportunity to do a lot more than think beyond themselves or their own lab or even their own department.
When we're sort of formulating these actions to proceed with, how would sort of the external stimuli of the environment or the headlines we're exposed to impact that? And would there be a way to sort of circumvent or stay away from the media other than entirely shutting oneself off?
Yes, so there are two parts of the answer to your question. The first one is that we can try to change the media, and we can try the stories that go in the media. And with the Climate Action Unit, we've done that. We've trained journalists to tell action-based stories about climate change rather than issue-based stories. And the second one is that you have control over what you spend your time thinking about. And it's my own personal coping mechanism is I am concerned about climate change. I spend all of my waking minutes thinking about this. I don't need to read another bad news story about it. It's not going to make any difference about what I am doing at the moment already. So any second that I would spend reading another analysis of how bad things are is a second lost on actually making the change happen. So once you are aware that the problem exists and that it needs urgent action, then start focusing on the action and don't keep on focusing on understanding the problem more and more and more. Because even if we understood the problem perfectly, we still then wouldn't have the solutions for it. We still wouldn't have the way of dealing with it. So once you have like a sufficient understanding of the problem, move on to the action as quickly as possible.
I think that's extremely inspiring on how to frame things when looking at them. So thank you for that. Thank you very much for having listened to this episode. We really hope that our listeners have enjoyed exploring the connections between climate change and mental health problems. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and newsletter to keep up to date with everything sustainability related at King's. And remember that we all are under the same sky and we're all dreaming the same dream. Together, we can all make positive changes for our mental health and the environment. Thank you.